Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of my monthly movie review roundup. I'm a bit late with this one, partly because I haven't really had the time or space to get some peace and quiet to record it, which is why I'm in the back of my shed, in the back of my garden, cold, lonesome, worried, tired, vulnerable. But anyway, so here are the films that I've seen this month and what I think about them. I'm going to skip a few of them because I have dedicated videos to them, like Gotti, like Killers of the Flower Moon, like Scarface. So the first film is Jumanji: The Next Level. This is the sequel to the first Jumanji movie with Dwayne Johnson. Well, I guess second, because the first Jumanji would technically be the Robin Williams one. But this is basically made in the same vein as the previous rendition, which I quite liked. It was a good, solid popcorn movie. I thought this one was just as enjoyable. The main cast is back and they're thrust into another adventure where they're in the game when they have to go through certain levels and complete certain challenges. It's definitely well worth the watch. If the original is a solid 7 out of 10, then this one is probably a solid 6. It is just a step down, I think, for various reasons. I think the script isn't as good as the previous film. Some of the lines were quite flat and on their own they weren't funny. The film is funny because of the actors. The actors are funny. The actors are charismatic. In fact, I did read something like this film is one of the quickest produced sequels in Hollywood history, something like that. And I suppose in that way, it does kind of feel like it. One key difference in this film from the previous is that in real life, it's different people who are sucked into the Jumanji game. So two of them, for example, are played by Danny DeVito and the other is Danny Glover. And Kevin Hart, for much of the film, who is the avatar of Danny Glover's character, spends most of the time doing a Danny Glover impression throughout most of the film. And there is a few instances of body swapping and whatnot. And that's where most of the humour actually comes from in the film. It's the actors playing each other and, you know, a masculine actor acting more feminine and the other way around. And again, like I said, it's the actors that kind of sell this film, because sometimes it does kind of feel like this movie is, okay, who can do the best Danny DeVito impression? And you're laughing at Dwayne Johnson's portrayal, at Kevin Hart's portrayal, at Jack Black's portrayal, because you know the actors who they're mimicking. So, for example, if Dwayne Johnson acted the way he did in the film, without any explanation, it probably wouldn't be as funny. But in our head, because we know of Danny DeVito's voice and his mannerisms, when we see Dwayne Johnson acting like that, now it's funny. So I guess I'm basically saying that this film probably shouldn't be as entertaining as it is. But it is. It's a solid film, and I enjoyed it. The next film I watched was the 1967 classic In the Heat of the Night, starring Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger, where in the Deep South, the racist South, a black police officer arrives by chance and he is embroiled in a murder case. In fact, initially he's actually a suspect, and throughout the film he's kind of a suspect, especially because obviously he's an alien, an outsider and a black person, and he helps the townsfolk solve the murder, partly because they are not really equipped to deal with such a case, and he comes from, I think it was Philadelphia or somewhere, where he is much more well versed in such issues. This film has something of a legendary status, and with that in mind, I'm not saying it was a disappointment, but sometimes, you know, when a film is touted as a huge classic, it was a landmark, a watershed moment, it was a statement, and then you watch it and you think, oh, it's a good film, but I don't really see the hype, because obviously a lot of the hype is because of the political nature of the film. Like, for example, I read somewhere that it was one of the first major color films to actually film a movie in terms of the color with black people in mind, because they look different on film to white people. So the cinematographers and the directors, they adjusted to suit. So things like that. But obviously, as someone sitting down watching the film in 2023, I'm not really thinking about it. I'm just focused on the story. And on that level, it is solid. It is a very enjoyable film. The two main leads did a great job, especially Rod Steiger. Rod Steiger's character was very good. It's one of those where, he comes off initially as, just a blanket kind of caricature, but there's a lot of deep insecurities the man has which slowly start to come out. the characters were really solid, and that's what the main takeaway for me is. Like I said, Rod Steiger's character, for example, very solid character, the kind of character that a YouTube channel like mine would probably do a whole video analysis on. But the mystery itself, the story, the murder mystery, the police stuff, that was probably the main kind of letdown. Letdown might be too much of a strong word, but the story itself was just kind of standard. I thought it was kind of basic. You find out who the killer is. Oh, it was that guy, and then the movie's over. So the movie is framed around this, the murder of this person. That itself is quite ordinary and simple, and which is probably where my kind of feelings of disappointment are, if I can even use that word. The things around it were excellent. The look of the film, the music, the acting, the characters, all of that kind of stuff. So maybe just if the foundation was a bit stronger, I would enjoy the complete package maybe a bit more. The next film I saw was Scream 6. Yeah, it's 6 now, isn't it? Yeah, so the recent one. I know there's another one set to come out. I didn't think this was a great installment. I mean, to let you know where I am, the original Wes Craven Scream is a modern day classic. The second one is an even better film. Third one was a bit of a disappointment, but it's still, as the other three, a kind of cozy horror film. The fourth one I thought was great. The fifth one was good. I enjoyed it, but it was a very safe film. It was a very formulaic film. In this one, it says, the survivors of the Ghostface killings leave Woodsboro behind and start a fresh chapter in New York City. So that's kind of supposed to be the kind of main thing about this film. It's that we've gone to New York, the Big Apple, the trains, the skyscrapers, all of that, Ghostface is hiding in and amongst all of this. But the movie never really utilizes that. It still kind of feels like, most of the action takes place in houses and whatnot. Yeah, I suppose there is one set piece where the characters put a ladder from one building to another and they have to climb before Ghostface comes in the room and starts shanking everyone. But I have issues with the Scream movies that get more and more pronounced, and they're most apparent in this one. Things like the comedy being taken too far, the meta levels of the film being taken too far. So, I mean, the original films, they played it so perfectly. They worked as films that you can watch, organic films. They worked as horror films. They worked as comedies. They worked as films that didn't take themselves too seriously, and they worked as meta films that were making some kind of commentary or just poking a bit of fun at the state of horror movies and the cliches of the genre. It's a very difficult balance to get right, but Wes Craven did it right. This one doesn't do it right. It swings too far in one direction and the other. Sometimes it feels like characters are just listing out cliches of the horror genre, and there's no cleverness to it. It's not intelligent anymore. It hasn't reinvented anything. And the story is kind of goofy now. It's too convoluted. The original had a great killer. The second one had a great killer. The third one was eh. The fourth one, I think, in hindsight, because of social media and everything, seems like a better reason for killing than it maybe would have done at the time. In this one, it's like, what's going on? And a big problem I have is that there's no tension anymore. And partly because, the set pieces in general are not as good as they used to be. But it's mainly because, people are constantly getting stabbed in this film. And they just keep coming back. There was one character who was like, da, 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 da. He got stabbed so many times and he survived. In fact, I don't think any of the major main characters died in this film. And when a film series is too afraid to kill off its cast, when so many people keep coming back, when getting stabbed doesn't mean anything anymore, how are you supposed to be immersed in it? How are you supposed to take things seriously anymore? It just didn't have that pull that previous films did. I didn't think the acting was all that great, aside from the main actress. And yeah, not really one of the better Scream movies. Probably the worst so far, I think, actually. Another film I watched was 1961's The Guns of Navarone. And it says, a team of allied saboteurs are assigned to an impossible task. Infiltrate an impregnable Nazi-held Greek island and destroy the two enormous long-range field guns that prevent the rescue of 2,000 trapped British soldiers. There's a few big names in here, like Gregory Peck and Anthony Quinn. a lot of the guys do kind of seem on the older side of things. Apparently, when the film was released, this was actually one of the main criticisms, like like The Irishman, where the actors are way too old for the roles they're playing because the real story is concerned men in the 20s and whatnot. But anyway, putting that to aside, it was a really good film. I don't even really know what to say about it because, when you just watch one of those old war films, those epic, grand films, you sit in your seat and you forget about everything else, and 2-3 hours go by and then it's over and you think, wow, that was a solid picture. This is one of those kind of movies. Everything about it was great. The acting was good. The characters were great. They weren't just stock characters. As the mission goes through, you start to see certain things, and this character has this insecurity, and that character doesn't trust this guy, and all that kind of stuff. The action was excellent. Especially for a film for its time. Right up until the very end, though, it was almost like the film kind of gave up at one point. There was a few things that happened in the final climax that were kind of hokey. Like there's one part where this guy, the good guy, he's walking up to these soldiers, these Nazis, and he's like, he mows down all of them. But there's one guy in the middle who he can't seem to shoot, and who starts shooting him. And the editing is kind of weird as well, but what ends up happening is they just both die or something, and you're thinking, what? He took all of them out, but he couldn't take one guy in the middle right in front of him out who was closer to him than any of the others. And there's another scene on a boat where two guys are fighting each other, and someone gets stabbed, which was shot so poorly. But aside from that, it was a really good film. There was genuine tension. The story was very good, where there is a mission, but during the mission things go wrong. And one of the most tense scenes is literally just the main characters climbing a massive hill or something. They're climbing up, with all the kind of equipment and whatnot. Rain and the dark. It's a film that really does keep you interested. A solid action commando movie. I also saw Christopher Nolan's Tenet, and for those who don't know, I've seen the film and I still don't know what it's about. I can't actually describe it. But the plot summary says, armed with only one word, Tenet, and fighting for the survival of the entire world, a protagonist, who is never named by the way, journeys through a twilight world of international espionage on a mission that will unfold in something beyond real time. So, Tenet, that synopsis, that plot summary, it sounds vintage Christopher Nolan, doesn't it? He loves James Bond. He made Inception, which was all this kind of high concept espionage action. And Tenet seems right up that alley. But it's one of Christopher Nolan's, perhaps his biggest misfire, unfortunately. It is not a film I thought was very good. It may have been too clever for its own good, that being one of its issues. Another being that it essentially encapsulates all of the main issues people have about Christopher Nolan's films, like his poor use of female characters, his really bad action scenes. There was a big scene near the end where people were running around shooting and fighting, and there was two good teams, a team red and team blue, and they were running through these buildings and all that. But you never really see what they're shooting at. You never see the bad guy shooting back. It was a really strangely shot scene, and it's a shame because it looks good visually. The cinematography was very good. And other complaints that people have about Christopher Nolan, over-convoluted plots. This was so over-convoluted. I still don't understand it. I don't get the whole thing about reversing the time and, bullets going backwards. Like, who put it there? And it was just, okay, I got some of it. Some of it was very clever, but it's one of those where it's like, it would take so much to understand it, but the reward of that isn't all that great because it commits the biggest sin a film can commit, which is that it quite simply is boring. One of the major complaints people had about this film when they watched it in cinemas was that they couldn't understand what people are saying. Again, that is a complaint I've always kind of had with a lot of Nolan films, like when Michael Caine is on his deathbed in Interstellar and he's mumbling his words, like the sound mixing and all of that. And Christopher Nolan got some backlash because of the way he responded to that criticism of this film. I didn't really have that problem because I watched the film with subtitles, but if I didn't have subtitles, I would have shared that problem. So the already complex, convoluted plot would have been even more confusing because essential parts of the dialogue would have been missing. But really, I mean, Tenet is high concept, but it's just dull. It lacks color. David Washington as the protagonist, he was just there. He just had this expression, didn't add anything to the film. Even his name, he doesn't even have a name. He's just the protagonist. It's like a flat screenplay, a draft that Christopher Nolan wrote before he even put the names of the characters and everything in, and that's just the script they just went ahead and shot with. Regarding the complex nature of the story and the whole thing about inversion and all of that, there's a line early on in the film where somebody says something like, "Don't try and understand it, just accept it," which was kind of weird considering she was talking to someone who really should have been in a position where he has to understand it given what he's supposed to do in the film. But I kind of take that's the filmmakers talking to us. Don't try and understand it, just accept it. A bit like kind of, like Inception, where they had the whole going into dreams thing. Like, how does that actually work tangibly? What are the methods? What are those wires? What is the machine? We don't need to know that. That's just the setup for the story and the action. So I accept that. But the thing is that the story and the action in this film is just blech, It feels like a tense movie, the music and everything. But you're thinking to yourself, there isn't really any tension. It's like an Emperor's New Clothes kind of situation. It's like, if you unpack all of this, where is the pull? What am I getting out of this experience? And just like with a lot of Christopher Nolan movies, but in the other ones you can accept it because it isn't as prominent or there isn't as much focus on or whatever. But it's just so contrived, It's like, without going too much into the story, there is a guy and he's a bad guy and he has this device which could cause the end of the world. But he's never going to use it, obviously, because that would involve killing himself. But, he is going to use it because he's actually got some kind of terminal illness. But he isn't going to use it yet. He's going to use it after he gets to a certain place on his boat where he had a great time with his wife a long time ago. Once he gets to that spot and has another great time with his wife, and when the day is done, then he's going to use it. And she is a plant for the main character. She has to make sure he delays using it so the main characters can go and do something that they need to do. And she knows what the mission is. She knows she has to delay him and placate to him. But she lets the emotions get better with her. And it's just, like, what? Come on, man. It's just too much. It's too contrived, these situations. It's one of those where you take the script and maybe his brother, you give it to him. Let him rejig it a bit. Give it to someone who will add a bit of fat to it, add a bit of flavor, add a bit of scenes where you just get to know the characters and start to love the characters, because it's just like, there's nobody's interesting in this film. There's nothing really to carry it. It's like Nolan had the concept in his mind and that's all he was focused on, and all of the other elements of filmmaking he just put to a side. It's a shame, really, because I think you could do a lot more with the concept. I'd like him to revisit it maybe, because when you watch the trailers and you see like the cars going backwards and all that kind of stuff, you think there's going to be some kind of Matrix action going on. But even the action, like with a lot of Nolan movies, was just blunt. There wasn't really much action in it anyway. But yeah, I mean, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10 or something. It's overcomplicated and it just isn't entertaining. So I watched this interesting film called American Made, which was released in 2017 and stars Tom Cruise. Funnily enough, it's actually one of the rare non-franchise films Tom Cruise has done in recent years. He went from someone who never made a sequel to one of his films to someone who just constantly makes sequels. And in between all of these is a small little film called American Made. Now it says, the story of Barry Seal, an American pilot who became a drug runner for the CIA in the 1980s in a clandestine operation that would be exposed as the Iran-Contra affair. Now this is, it's based on a true story, but a lot of the facts it's basically a fictional version of the event. It's a kind of thriller comedy where this guy inadvertently starts working for the CIA. He goes and does loads of deals and flies back and forth between America and South America, and he meets Fidel Castro among other people, and he just gets more and more deeper and deeper into this world, starts making more and more and more money, so much so that it's literally bursting out of his closets and everything in his home. It's a very entertaining film, I thought. I really liked the way it was made, the style. Kind of feels like, that whole kind of Scorsese, Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street kind of method of making films. It's like a 2-hour trailer. It's a very fun movie, a very entertaining movie. even though it might be about some very serious things. And in fact, it does kind of make you think, because when you hear the stories of how uh, America and the CIA, they funded this clandestine operation in the Middle East. It funded these rebels in South America, and what was the this movie kind of humanizes that. It kind of shows you what was actually happening on the ground floor. How did the people get involved, both on the American side and the non-American side, and people on the outside like Barry Seal, who just are kind of caught up in this kind of situation. How everybody has an agenda, but nobody really has some kind of grand master plan. They're all just kind of second guessing and guessing. And obviously the story itself isn't 100% true, but you kind of get the feel of how some of these stories that we hear about, like the Iran-Contra and other things, how they would have come about. The US funding ISIS and all that kind of stuff. You can kind of get a feel of how that would tangibly happen after watching a film like American Made. But even aside from all of that, it's a very fun, entertaining kind of action film. Tom Cruise is in fine form. He was terrific as the lead, very charismatic, very captivating. And I had a great time with this film. So another film I watched was Steven Spielberg's recent film, The Fablemans. Now this follows a young boy who falls in love with filmmaking, and it shows his journey to become a filmmaker. It's not, as you might expect, him starting his career as a film director. In fact, the movie actually ends at that point, and I would have probably been more interested in seeing the story of that guy. It's everything before then, from when he was a child up to the point where he basically goes into a Hollywood office and he gets a job. Now, it's very well known that this film is basically an autobiography when it comes to Steven Spielberg. It's him telling his own life. And, that to me is kind of problematic. It's kind of funny because I've heard a lot of people say this movie is Steven Spielberg's love letter to cinema. A lot of filmmakers have a movie that is called that. Martin Scorsese has Hugo, for example. But I didn't really feel like this was a love letter to cinema. I felt like it was a love letter from Scorsese to himself. Because it has a kind of self-indulgent flavor to it. It feels like a story made by Spielberg for Spielberg. Which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, it is a big budget Hollywood production. It's not a small film you're making in your own back garden for you and your kids. I had to watch it. There's so many things that happen in this film that make me think, why is this in the film? Like, there's a part where these characters, they chase a tornado and they stop and they see this trolley just kind of moving past. I like, what is this saying? What is it representing? I'm just a complete blank. And the only thing I can think of is that it must have happened in real life, and that's why Spielberg put it in the film. And when I did some research, it seems that is the case. The film is almost 100% accurate in terms of what happened with Spielberg's life. He was crying throughout a lot of filming it because it brought back nostalgia and memories and whatnot. And that's good and fine and everything, but you still have to make an entertaining film. And for a lot of The Fablemans, it just wasn't, it just kind of fell a bit flat. And I know I kind of sound like I just moan about the films. But I mean, there were some really good scenes in here. There's a part where, a completely wordless part, a wordless scene where nobody speaks, it's just music, of the young man finding out that his mother has a thing for a family friend. And that was the best scene in the film by far. That was like a throwback to vintage Spielberg. I'm trying to think, what reason would someone have for watching a film like The Fablemans? The only real reason I can see is to get an insight into Steven Spielberg as a young boy from his own words. But I mean, if I wanted to see, if I wanted an insight into Steven Spielberg, I'd probably just watch a Spielberg documentary or read a book or something. Because as a narrative, it's just flat. It's a 6 out of 10, just like Tenet. Because look, okay, movies are often about something, and then they are really about something else. Yeah, there's the text, then there's the subtext. Scorsese is an absolute master at this. You've got a film like The Wolf of Wall Street, which can be watched as a sex, drugs, and rock and roll comedy, because that's what it is. You got all of the partying, you got DiCaprio doing weird stuff, all of that. That's the base level. That's the text. But what Scorsese is actually doing is he's critiquing capitalism. He's critiquing materialism. He's critiquing hedonism. He's on an interview. He said that he made the film in anger. Yeah, and you can feel that. You know, there's undercurrents there, there's things sprinkled in there, there's little lines of dialogue, there's things the main character does and how you're supposed to react. There's the famous final shot. That's the subtext. So he's making a film that is about just a guy, you know, on drugs and doing whatnot, but he's actually making a film about all of that stuff. The Irishman is similar, where, you know, the text is, it's a gangster film. It's about gangster doing mob stuff. The subtext is that it's a film about death, about dying, about legacy, about retrospection, about looking back on your life, introspection, all that kind of stuff. So you have to have that kind of, you know, that framework, which is the base of your film, which the masses can enjoy, and then you add the kind of what it's really about. Hugo, as already mentioned, is another great example. What is that film about? It's about a boy who, you know, he has to unlock the key to this puzzle or something, and his father died, blah, blah, blah. There's a story to it. But what is it really about? It's a love letter to cinema. We all know this. It's clear. This is where Spielberg fails, because there is no kind of real core to the film. We know what the subtext is. We know this is him saying, everybody, this is my story growing up. But there is nothing really in the film on a narrative level that is really that interesting, unfortunately. There is some interesting stuff with the mum, because she isn't quite right, and it's like, oh, okay, so that's interesting, you know, she has, you know, maybe mental issues or whatnot. But it's interesting because you're watching it thinking, oh, that must have happened to Spielberg's mum. Oh, that must have happened to Spielberg's father. Oh, these events happened to Spielberg in his life. That's the only reason why many of these scenes would be considered interesting. Otherwise, they're just so weird. Like this random scene of this Christian girlfriend the main character gets when he's in high school or something, and she tries to convert him, and the scene that I'm guessing is supposed to be funny and whatnot, but you know, it just kind of feels like an old guy looking through a scrapbook that he wrote when he was younger and just flicking through pages of old family photos, you know, which is all great. And, you know, maybe the main takeaway here is that this is a film not made for the likes of me. And there is obviously a kind of feeling of narcissism, really, when somebody makes a movie about themselves, about their past, that the movie they have complete control over. Like, for example, Spielberg, the character in the movie, gets bullied by these two guys. And it ends up in a situation where, you know, he comes out looking at the better person, the victor. One of these bullies, I think, you know, he loses basically, and the other guy ends up looking up to the main character. And again, like I said, you know, if somebody else made this movie about Spielberg, you wouldn't mind that. But when it's him doing it himself, it does kind of feel self-important and narcissistic. The movie has that kind of ugly pseudo sentimentality that a lot of Spielberg's modern movies do have. Here, it just kind of feels artificial, and I didn't really connect with the film, unfortunately. So another film I watched was Hi Mom by Brian De Palma, starring Robert De Niro. And this is a comedy drama, and the movie is about a Vietnam vet moves into an apartment and peers through other people's windows across the street, meets one of the women, and discovers black theatre. So apparently this film is a sequel to a film called Greetings, which I haven't seen, but you don't really need to know too much about the first one. It is such a difficult film to describe. It's such a weird movie, and it doesn't really follow a proper narrative structure. It goes from here to here to here to here, and it is funny. It is an interesting film. It has that kind of experimental 60s vibe to it, and so, I mean, let me try and explain it. So initially it starts off as a kind of quirky comedy about this guy who wants to be a photographer. He tries to convince this film producer to give him equipment or something to make his film. And his film is basically peeping in windows of people who live in an apartment across his, and which obviously leads to some funny scenes where we see people getting up to all sorts of nonsense in the privacy of their own homes. And it's got a really good style to it. You know, there's all sorts of things that would become, I mean, and funnily enough, I watched a film like this that De Palma made, and you compare it to the films that he's famous for, and those films are actually less inventive than something like Hi Mom, with its freeze frames and the text telling you what's happened in between two time jumps, and all sorts of different kind of narrative effects that were quite funky and kept you on your toes. So that's kind of the main gist of the first half of the film. The second half is really different. He gets involved in this a kind of this underground group who their mission is to kind of make New Yorkers know what it's like to feel like to be black. And so they keep handing out leaflets to this thing called Be Black Baby or something. It's a kind of, performance art thing. And he is hired to be an actor as part of this, to be a police officer. And so a bunch of white people, they go into this room or something, this house, and it becomes really dark, it becomes like this thing, because it's handheld footage of one of the people filming it. So it feels real, it feels like these people aren't actually acting, that they were sucked into this thing where they're just getting abused, they get hit, they get stuff stolen from them. I think the whole point is that, this is what it's like for us, kind of thing. And it very much feels like one of the women is about to get raped, and she does get violated to an extent, clothes ripped off and all sorts of stuff. And De Niro comes in pretending to be a police officer, and he makes things worse, and the people are just terrified. And it was really, it should actually be, that little segment should be its own separate film. It's almost like a horror film. Then it ends with them all saying that, oh, it was such a great experience, and everything, which I think is kind of part of the point, in that they still don't really know what it feels like. But I don't really know what the point of this film is. I don't know what it's trying to say. I guess there is some kind of, counterculture thing going on, maybe Vietnam War thing going on. But overall, it's just a kind of weird, sometimes quirky, sometimes funny, sometimes disturbing film that I guess is worth watching for De Palma purists and anyone who kind of wants to see the early films of the Hollywood New Wave folk. But, would you watch it for the sake of watching a fulfilling, entertaining film? Probably not. One other film I watched was Night of the Creeps. This is an 80s film. I wouldn't say it's got a reputation as a classic, but it is quite well loved. It's a horror comedy. Alien brain parasites entering humans through the mouth turn their host into killing zombies. Some teenagers start to fight against them. So it's, quite a standard story. The biggest actor in the film is the wonderful Tom Atkins, famous for these kind of B-movie horror films and whatnot. It's a film very conscious of what it is. There's a lot of jokes actually referencing the nature of B-movies and whatnot. If you're someone who likes, zombie films, horror films, just 80s horror films in general, they're different, aren't they? They have a kind of comfort to them. You can relax when watching them, even if what you're watching is, innocent people having aliens come into their mouth, eating their brains and then exploding, and it all sounds horrific, but there's something quite comfortable about it. And I thought it was okay, it's one of the, it's not top tier, it's not one of the great horror comedies of the 80s, nor is it one I'd consider to be one of the better ones, but it is worth watching, in and amongst the sea of horror films that exist from the 1980s. Definitely, on one Saturday afternoon and whatnot, it wouldn't hurt to see Night of the Creeps. Some of it was quite different, the opening segment it actually has aliens fighting in some spaceship or something, and then something falls out of the spaceship, and that is kind of the goo or whatever that turns people into zombies. There's another segment which is in black and white, homage to 1950s horror films, and then time jumps to the modern day 80s. The main character is a kind of like a geek, and he's trying to get this girl. He was okay. He was a little bit boring, but I suppose he has to be, because his best friend, who is very entertaining, is a character who was given all the best lines. He's very quirky, very funny, and he's quite a fully realized character. And I suppose you have to have, the yin and yang. Then you got Tom Atkins, who plays this cop who's got a traumatic past, who's trying to deal with that. And there's a couple of bullies. There's the girl that the main character's trying to get. And all of them kind of get sucked into this storyline of these alien parasites who are taking over people's bodies. It's decent stuff. The last film on the list is Puss in Boots, The Last Wish. So this is a film that was on my radar because I heard a lot of people praising it. When you think of animated films, especially animated sequels, they're just stuff to put kids in the cinema, make a bit of money and whatnot. But this one had a better reputation than most, and I suppose it deserves it. It was quite a good film. I don't really have too much to say about it, I guess. Basically, it's about Puss in Boots, who is now on his ninth life. And there's actually quite a funny little homage where it shows you him dying repeatedly. And though the film completely works on its own and it doesn't pander to the Shrek universe, there are a few cameos and whatnot which the kids will love. But anyway, Puss in Boots is on his ninth life. He is hounded and harassed by this creepy wolf, which basically represents death. He's kind of lost his mojo now, and he goes on a quest to find this thing that will give him a wish. And obviously what he'll wish for is to have his 9 lives restored. There's a few cool supporting characters like Goldilocks and the 3 bears. There's the bad guy Jack Horner. There's a female companion for Puss in Boots, and this kind of funny, quirky side character. And they all kind of get thrown into this quest to find the last wish, which everybody wants. It was a very loud film. There wasn't a lot of times where there was just peace and quiet. I don't know why I'm mentioning that. I know it's a weird complaint to have about a children's film, but it's just kind of something that stuck out to me. But it was a good film. It's probably one where adults might find a little bit to pull at, in the sense that he's going through an existential crisis. He's thinking about death. He's thinking about what he's done in life and whatnot. So that kind of stuff is, I guess, interesting. And also, the characters are quite good because they all have their different motivations. Some are motivated by selfishness, like Puss in Boots himself, for example. And, Goldilocks wants the thing because she wants a real family. And when she mentions that, it offends the bears, who have been looking after her all this time. But she says, I'm not a bear, I'm a human being. All that kind of stuff. And over the course of the film, characters do change. And they the kind of spirit of the film is teamwork and sacrifice and selflessness. And these themes aren't really hammered over you, on the head. They're not blunt and obvious. It kind of organically manifests as the film goes on, which you have to give the film credit for. It doesn't need to be as subtle as it was. But yeah, it was a good little kids film. I would definitely recommend it. I would think it's worth watching. And so that concludes this episode of Monthly Movie Review Roundup. If you've seen any of these films that I've mentioned and talked about, let me know what you think of them down in the comment section below. And thanks for watching.